A racist white police officer kicked the wrong black woman inside the courtroom, out of pure prejudice and abuse of power, but minutes later, karma struck so hard, it left everyone speechless. She hadn't even spoken a word when it happened. She had only stepped into the courtroom, calm, composed, documents in hand, wearing a simple beige suit that didn't scream power or authority, but radiated quiet confidence. And maybe that's exactly what triggered him. Maybe it was the way she walked in without asking for permission. Maybe it was the way she held her head high without the need to prove anything to anyone. Or maybe, it was just her skin. The moment she walked through the door, he zeroed in on her like a predator. "Who the hell let you in here?" he barked, loud enough for every head in the courtroom to turn. She didn't even flinch. She kept walking. "I said back off, he growled again, marching toward her like a storm. She opened her mouth, not to argue, but simply to speak, but she didn't get the chance. He kicked the folder out of her hand, sending documents flying across the polished courtroom floor. His boot connected with her bag next, knocking it sideways. Then, in front of a silent room full of legal professionals, clerks, and court officers, he shoved her hard in the chest with both hands. Her body stumbled backward, heels scraping, and hit the floor with a sound that echoed louder than any gavel ever had. For a moment, no one moved. And that was the worst part. No one gasped. No one stood up. No one said a word. It wasn't just the brutality that hurt, it was the permission in their silence. That quiet courtroom didn't just witness an assault. It enabled it. "You people always think you can do whatever the hell you want," the officer muttered, shaking his head with disgust as if he were the victim of some disrespect. "Get up and get out before I drag you out in cuffs. This area is restricted to court officials. You don't belong here." Still on the ground, she looked around, not for help, but for answers. For some kind of validation that this wasn't actually happening. But the only thing that looked back at her were blank faces and turned eyes. She slowly picked up her bag. Her hands trembled, but her eyes didn't. Not once. And then something shifted. She didn't speak. She didn't argue. She just stood up. Slowly. Calmly. As if she wasn't rising from the ground, but ascending to something higher. She dusted off her sleeves. Collected every scattered paper in absolute silence. Not a single curse. Not a single tear. And as the bailiff opened his mouth to say something else, something cruel no doubt, a voice boomed from the hallway, "Is she here yet?" The courtroom door opened, and a sharply dressed U.S. Marshal stepped inside, scanning the room. His eyes landed on the woman. He gave a respectful nod and spoke loud enough for all to hear. "Ma'am, the state commissioner is on the line waiting to welcome you. They said congratulations are in order." The entire room froze. The officer who had just shoved her. His face drained of color like someone had cut the lights behind his eyes. Now people were looking, but not in judgment of her. In fear of what she was. That moment rewound everything. People scrambled to correct their posture. The bailiff who had assaulted her took one awkward step back. The judge, previously silent, leaned forward with panic behind his spectacles. And yet, she said nothing. She simply walked past the officer, her bag on her shoulder, and her step steady like nothing had ever interrupted them. No threats. No outrage. No drama. Just undeniable power in silence. But what nobody in that room knew, what even the marshal hadn't said out loud yet, was that she wasn't just anyone coming to visit. She wasn't just some state employee or federal observer. She was his new boss. And not only that, she had access to every disciplinary file, every misconduct report, every internal affairs log in the department. Including his. Including the one she herself had once written years ago, before she was forced out, silenced, pushed away like trash. She had returned not to watch, but to lead. And she had come prepared. Because this wasn't just a coincidence. This was a reckoning. That officer had crossed paths with the one woman whose career he had helped destroy once before. And he didn't even recognize her. But she recognized everything. His voice. His stance. His attitude. The way he still wore his racism like a uniform under the badge. The same man who had once lied on record to ruin her career had now, by his own arrogance, handed her the one thing she never had before, proof. Witnesses. Surveillance. Silence from a courtroom full of people who wouldn't be able to deny what they saw. What happens when the oppressor doesn't realize he's handing power back to the oppressed? What happens when justice walks back into the room, not in handcuffs, but in heels? And most of all, what will she do with the power now that she finally has it? The silence that followed her reveal wasn't just fear. It was the beginning of accountability. It was the sound of every smug assumption collapsing. And what she does next, how she chooses to handle the very man who humiliated her in front of dozens, will not only define her legacy, but change the entire department forever. But the real question isn't what she does to him. It's what he did to her years ago that made this moment so personal. And trust me, you're not ready for the truth behind why she was really there that day. Are you? Before we begin today's story, we want to take a moment to speak directly to our Black viewers. Here at Plow of Twist, we stand firmly against any form of racism, discrimination, or abuse of power. Your voice, your presence, and your story matter. This channel exists to shed light on injustices and turn pain into power through storytelling. You are seen. You are valued. You belong here. Now, sit back and get ready for a powerful ride. Make sure to subscribe to Plow of Twist and turn on notifications so you never miss a twist that hits home. The morning sun in Birmingham, Alabama, filtered through the narrow blinds of a modest but tidy apartment, casting long streaks of light across the living room floor. The place was quiet, almost too quiet for someone with a schedule as relentless as hers. Tiana Hayes stood in front of the mirror, adjusting the sleeves of her beige blazer with slow, measured movements. The suit wasn't new, but it was pressed with precision, just like everything else in her life. Nothing about Tiana was ever left to chance. Every detail, every gesture, every silence she allowed herself in public had been cultivated through years of having to be 3 steps ahead in every room she walked into. The world hadn't handed her grace or second chances, so she built her own ladder, one rung at a time, and learned to climb in heels. She looked at her reflection. 36 years old. Sharp eyes, unwavering. A calm face that rarely betrayed what was happening behind it. There was something about Tiana that people noticed but couldn't quite describe. Maybe it was the stillness in her voice when things got tense. Maybe it was the way she asked questions that made people nervous, like she already knew the answer. But behind that poise, there were battles no one saw, battles that shaped her into the woman walking into that courthouse that day. Born and raised in Birmingham's West Side, Tiana grew up between survival and aspiration. Her mother, a former schoolteacher who worked 3 jobs after the district cut funding, never let her daughter believe that excellence was optional. Her father, a mechanic turned preacher, taught her that strength wasn't loud, it was consistent. As a kid, Tiana watched her parents sacrifice dignity for stability, smile through condescension, and hold their heads high while the world tried to press them down. That legacy wasn't just in her blood, it was in her spine. Every degree she earned, every hallway she walked through as the only black woman in a room full of suits, was a quiet rebellion against what was expected of her. Tiana had studied criminal justice and public administration, graduating at the top of her class. Her record was immaculate. Her evaluations were stellar. She had done everything right, and yet, every job came with a reminder that, right, didn't always matter when you looked like her. She had risen through government ranks with caution and composure, knowing that one misstep, one moment of showing too much emotion or too little deference, could close doors she hadn't even knocked on yet. Her life wasn't just about success. It was about survival in a system built to doubt her every move. The day she walked into Jefferson County Courthouse wasn't meant to be dramatic. It was procedural. Routine. She had been appointed to a new position that week, one that came with a badge, a state seal, and the kind of authority few people like her were ever granted. But even that power, she knew, came with a ticking clock. She had seen how fast black women in leadership were undermined, challenged, sabotaged. That morning, as she zipped up her case folder and clipped on her ID badge, though she would carry it in her bag, not around her neck, she wasn't thinking about revenge or making statements. She was thinking about how to walk in, do the job, and walk out without making waves. She had no idea the waves would come crashing regardless. Across town, Officer Brian Cormack was finishing his third cup of black coffee, flipping through paperwork with the kind of boredom that breeds carelessness. His badge had been pinned to the same uniform for almost 20 years. White, tall, and heavy-set with a permanent scowl carved into his face, Cormack was known in the department as old school. The kind of officer who prided himself on keeping order, the way his father had taught him, aggressively, without questions, and certainly without apologies. His record had bruises, internal complaints, most of them dismissed, body cam footage gone missing more than once, an ex-wife who'd left him mid-promotion, and 2 sons he barely called. But none of that had stopped him from patrolling courtrooms like they were war zones and civilians like they were enemies. He believed in structure. In power. In knowing your place. And when people didn't, he reminded them. Roughly, if needed. Officer Cormack had never met Tiana. He didn't know her background. He didn't know the weight of the legacy she carried or the authority she held. All he saw, when she walked into that courtroom foyer, was a black woman walking like she belonged somewhere. And that, to him, was enough of a threat. Her confidence didn't match his expectation. Her silence felt defiant. Her presence, unbothered and composed, triggered something in him he didn't fully understand, but had felt before. It wasn't about who she was. It was about what she represented. And Brian Cormack had spent his whole life believing that people like her should knock before entering. Should wait to be invited. Should prove themselves before being respected. He had no idea that his own career was now tethered to the woman he had just decided to humiliate. Inside the courthouse, the air was stiff with routine. Lawyers shuffling files, court reporters reviewing schedules, clerks tapping on keyboards. No one paid much attention to the woman who walked in holding a manila folder, her hair pulled back neatly, her heels clicking softly on the marble floor. She wasn't escorted. She didn't arrive with a crowd. There were no red carpets or nameplates. Just her and her confidence. She walked past the front desk with a polite nod, but no explanation. She didn't need to ask where to go, she had been here before, years ago, under very different circumstances. Tiana entered the courtroom through the side corridor used by court officials and legal counsel. It wasn't a violation, it was part of the approved entry protocol for her new role. But the moment Officer Cormack saw her walking through that corridor without an escort or visible credentials, his posture changed. His eyes narrowed. To him, she didn't belong. Not because of anything she did, but because of everything she was. He stepped forward, blocking her path, and before she could reach into her bag to present her identification, it had already begun. She didn't argue. She didn't fight. Her lips parted to speak, but the confrontation had been decided before her voice had even left her throat. What followed wasn't just an overreaction. It was the kind of violent overstep that people try to explain away later with excuses like misunderstanding or miscommunication. But everyone in that room knew what they saw. And more importantly, she knew what she felt. After it happened, there was no siren, no chaos. Just an oppressive quiet. The kind that makes your heart beat louder than usual. Tiana stood up slowly, eyes surveying the room, not with fear, but with calculation. Not a single person had intervened. Not one voice had spoken out. And in that stillness, she realized something deeper than pain or humiliation. She realized she was still alone in a system that hadn't changed as much as they wanted her to believe. But what no one in that courtroom knew, what even Officer Cormac couldn't begin to imagine, was that this wasn't the first time Tiana Hayes had been shoved down by the system. And it wouldn't be the last time she got back up. Because beneath her calm surface lived a story of betrayal, silence, injustice, and a plan she had waited years to see through. A plan that was never about revenge. It was about truth. And now, the truth was standing back on its feet, inside a courtroom, with eyes wide open and nothing left to lose. What would you do if the person who ruined your life didn't even remember your face? And what happens when that person needs your approval to keep their job? You're about to find out. The hours after the incident moved like syrup through the courthouse, thick with whispers and glances. What had started as a regular morning had quietly curdled into discomfort. People didn't say it out loud, but everyone knew something had shifted. The silence after Tiana had walked away from Officer Cormac wasn't just guilt, it was fear. A few staffers tried to pretend it hadn't happened, burying themselves in paperwork, avoiding eye contact with her whenever she crossed the halls again later that day. Some wondered who she really was. Some assumed she'd file a complaint and disappear. But no one imagined she would return to that same building the very next morning, not as a visitor, not as a witness, but as the new acting director of internal oversight and compliance for the Alabama Department of Justice. Tiana's appointment wasn't symbolic. It was powerful. She had authority over every officer assigned to courthouse security, over every misconduct report, every surveillance camera, every internal file. And the man who shoved her in front of witnesses now had to report to her desk. Still, she didn't act hastily. She didn't burst through rooms demanding apologies or leverage the weight of her role like a weapon. She observed. She walked the halls, collected information, studied behaviors. There was something more dangerous than confrontation, patience. And Tiana had mastered it. Inside her office, a stark room on the third floor with tall windows overlooking the courthouse steps, she flipped through digital files with precise clicks, scanning years of records, patterns of abuse, flagged complaints. Officer Cormac's name appeared more than once. Excessive force. Harassment. Verbal misconduct. Every one of them labeled inconclusive or unfounded. But what stood out wasn't just the complaints. It was the frequency. The patterns. The kind of familiarity that only time and impunity could breed. Her assistant, a sharp young law graduate named Andre, hovered in the doorway one afternoon, hesitant. He wasn't sure how to bring it up, but eventually, he asked, "Ma'am, are you sure you want to be the one handling the review on him?" She looked up from her laptop and raised an eyebrow, not angry, curious. He continued, "I mean, there's a lot of talk around here. People are watching. Some say maybe it'd be cleaner if someone else took the file." Tiana leaned back in her chair, folded her hands, and said evenly, "If I passed off every file that made people uncomfortable, nothing would change. And besides, it's not about me. It's about what's been allowed to happen. For years." Meanwhile, Officer Cormac grew restless. He hadn't been suspended, yet. But he noticed the shift. Colleagues weren't laughing at his jokes anymore. Conversations stopped when he entered rooms. He heard things, murmurs of investigation, of surveillance reviews, of past reports being reopened. He tried to brush it off, tried to spin it like some liberal witch hunt. But deep down, he knew. He had seen the look in her eyes after he shoved her. Calm. Cold. Knowing. He hadn't recognized her at first. But something about her voice, her presence, started gnawing at him. It felt familiar. Like a shadow from a past he never cared to revisit. Days passed. Tiana requested meetings, not just with courthouse staff, but with community liaisons, legal aid groups, and families who had filed complaints in the past. She asked questions that most officials avoided. When did you stop trusting the system? What happened after you filed the report? Did anyone ever call you back? Each story poured into her like gasoline on slow-burning embers. One mother, voice cracking, described how her son had been tackled outside a traffic court hearing because he didn't respond fast enough to an order. Another woman recounted being dragged by the arm from a waiting room because she refused to leave her husband's hearing. Cormac's name appeared again. And again. Always a common denominator. Late one afternoon, as she walked toward the exit of the courthouse, she saw him standing by the metal detector, rigid, watching her. Their eyes locked. For the first time, he looked away. She didn't stop walking, but her voice cut the air cleanly as she passed. "We'll be in touch soon." He didn't respond, but his jaw tightened. That night, he didn't sleep. Back in her office, Tiana stared at a sealed folder on her desk. Inside, there were records no one had ever expected to see again. A case dismissed before it reached formal review. A complaint made by a young state employee, a woman who had worked in an administrative compliance office years ago. That woman had filed a detailed report about excessive force, falsified statements, and racial misconduct. The officer named in the complaint, Brian Cormac. The name of the employee? Tiana Hayes. The file had been buried. Witnesses retracted. The case dissolved. And soon after, she was quietly transferred out of her department. Andre walked in just as she closed the file. "The judge confirmed your seat at tomorrow's ethics hearing," he said. "And they've been informed that you're leading the presentation on misconduct cases from the last decade." Tiana nodded. Her voice calm, "Good. Make sure Officer Cormac is present." The next morning, the courtroom was full, press, officials, even local community leaders had gathered. It wasn't a trial. It was an open ethics session. But it might as well have been a stage for something bigger. People knew something was coming. The tension was thick with anticipation. Officer Cormac sat 2 rows from the front, his uniform crisp, hands clasped tightly. He tried to look composed. But his eyes betrayed him. Tiana stood at the podium, her presence commanding without theatrics. "Today," she began, "we're not here to point fingers. We're here to expose patterns. To examine how silence enables misconduct. And to ask ourselves why some people are allowed to break the rules so long they forget rules even exist." The room held its breath. She clicked the remote in her hand, and the first slide appeared on the screen behind her. Complaint 1. Then 2. Then 3. Redacted names, documented dates, audio clips. All tied together by one badge number. Cormac's badge number. As murmurs spread through the room, she didn't raise her voice. She didn't need to. Her restraint spoke louder than rage. She presented facts, not accusations. Patterns, not opinions. And as each complaint was laid bare, it became impossible to ignore the rot beneath the surface. From the corner of his seat, Cormac started to sweat. He leaned forward, whispered something to the officer beside him. But no one responded. The badge wasn't protecting him anymore. Tiana paused, looked up, and locked eyes with him once more. "What you allow," she said, "is what will continue. Until someone decides to stop allowing it." What no one in the room expected, what even Cormac had no way of anticipating, was that she hadn't even started telling the real story yet. The story of what he did to her. The story he forgot. The file he never thought she'd find again. And that's when she clicked to the final slide. But before she spoke, she paused. Let the silence grow. Let the weight settle. Because what was about to be revealed, would change everything. The courtroom had never felt like this before. It wasn't loud. It wasn't chaotic. But something about the silence, the way people held their breath without realizing it, made the tension feel physical. You could feel it in your chest, like the moment before a thunderstorm breaks. Tiana stood still at the front of the room, her fingers resting gently on the edge of the podium. The screen behind her still displayed the badge number. A number that no longer held power, but shame. No one in the room looked at Officer Brian Cormack directly, but everyone felt him. Felt his discomfort. Felt the weight of years unraveling in real time. His presence was shrinking by the second. Tiana didn't speak right away. She was calm, composed, almost quiet. But her silence wasn't hesitation, it was control. The kind of control you earn when you've spent years being silenced and finally get the floor with no one left to interrupt you. She shifted her gaze slowly across the room, scanning faces, watching their reactions, letting the moment breathe before she finally spoke. Her voice was low and steady. "There's one last case I want to bring to your attention," she said, almost like she was beginning a story, not making a statement. It was filed internally in April of 2013. A complaint made by a compliance analyst against a courthouse security officer. A few heads turned. No one moved. The complaint was detailed. It included witness names, camera locations, a physical injury, and a formal statement accusing the officer of targeting the analyst due to her race and gender. She reached into the folder on the table beside her, pulled out a printed document, and held it without lifting it high. She didn't need to. The words would carry themselves. The analyst was transferred 2 weeks later. The officer remained. The file was never processed. The witnesses withdrew their statements. She paused again. Her next words came slower, heavier. "The reason I know this complaint so well is because I wrote it." Gasps. Not many, but enough. Enough to ripple through the room. Officer Cormack didn't blink. He sat like stone. But beneath the surface, he was unraveling. Tiana stepped away from the podium and walked toward the center of the room, not for drama, but because she wanted to look him in the eye when she said it. "You didn't recognize me, did you?" Her tone wasn't mocking. It was matter of fact. "You shoved me to the floor 2 weeks ago with the same hand you once grabbed my wrist in the hallway near records. The same voice you used to tell me I was lucky to even have a job back then, you used again to tell me I didn't belong. You never remembered my name, but I never forgot yours." The judge shifted uncomfortably in his chair. No one dared to interrupt her. Cormack sat frozen, his jaw clenched, breathing shallow. Tiana took one more step forward. Her expression didn't change. "I was 24, she continued, her voice dipping just slightly with emotion now. "New to the department. I filed a complaint because I believed the system would do the right thing. Instead, I was moved to another office with no explanation, and my name disappeared from every project I'd worked on. You walked through this courthouse for 10 more years like nothing happened, while I had to rebuild my career brick by brick outside of the department that turned its back on me." Cormack finally spoke, his voice hoarse, trying to muster strength he didn't have. "That was a long time ago. People remember things differently." She didn't blink. "Do you remember the bruise on my arm? Or the way you told me I was too sensitive for this job?" She didn't wait for his answer. "Because I do." He looked down. His hands were shaking now, and his voice cracked. "I didn't know it was you that day. I didn't know who you were." "You didn't need to know," she said, almost gently. "Because it wasn't personal. It was predictable. It's how you treat people you think don't matter. And that's what makes this worse." He stood up, abruptly, his voice rising. "I didn't mean to," she cut him off, not by shouting, but with the kind of clarity that silences a room. "But you did. You meant every word. You meant to humiliate me. You meant to assert control. You meant to show everyone around you that you could do what you wanted and no one would stop you. And for a long time, no one did. She turned back toward the audience. But that ends today. No applause. No gasps now. Just silence. Heavy, suffocating silence. Cormac sank back into his chair, visibly deflated. There was no defense left. The room had become a witness, not just to her pain, but to his unraveling. Tiana returned to the podium and took a deep breath. When people ask me why I came back, this is why. I came back because silence is the real sickness. Because I've seen what happens when no one speaks. And because people like him don't just survive in the shadows, they thrive there. Until someone turns on the light. She looked out at the crowd, officials, officers, lawyers, journalists. This isn't about revenge. This is about accountability. And accountability doesn't start with punishment, it starts with truth. Her words lingered in the air like smoke. People sat still, some blinking rapidly, others visibly uncomfortable, unsure of what to say, what to do. They had just watched a woman turn her pain into power, without raising her voice, without slamming a gavel, without needing anyone to defend her. She didn't reclaim her power. She never lost it. The world just hadn't been ready to see it before. Outside the courthouse, the sky had turned gray, soft thunder rumbling in the distance. Inside, the storm had already passed, and left nothing untouched. But something still hung in the air. A question. What would happen next? What would she do with the power she now held? And more importantly, what had she just set in motion that no one in that room could yet see? The air in the courtroom hadn't moved. Not really. It felt like time had slowed to let the truth sink in. Tiana stood still at the front, her presence filling the space in a way no title or badge ever could. She wasn't just delivering evidence, she was delivering memory, justice, and the weight of years no one else had to carry. Every eye was on her, and for once, not a single one doubted her. Not because of what she said, but because of how she said it. Calm. Grounded. Certain. The kind of certainty that only comes from living through something you never should have had to survive. The kind of certainty that doesn't need to scream to be heard. Across the room, Officer Cormac sat with his hands gripping the edges of his seat. His face was pale now, his lips pressed tightly together, jaw ticking like he was grinding something bitter between his teeth. His body looked too large for the chair, like the weight of everything Tiana had unearthed was pressing down on him from every direction. And still, no one spoke. The silence wasn't awkward anymore, it was respect. It was the room finally understanding that the person they had watched walk through those doors every day was not who they thought he was. And the woman they ignored 2 weeks ago? She was not here to ask for anything. She was here to end something. Then came the voice of the judge, soft but firm. Ms. Hayes, is there anything else you'd like to add for the record? Tiana turned her head toward him, and her voice came out more vulnerable now, the edge of steel in her tone giving way to something deeper, something personal. Yes. One more thing. She looked directly at Cormac. Her next words were not spoken to the court, not to the crowd, not even to the judge. They were for him. You took something from me, she said, not accusing, just remembering. You took my belief that the system I worked for could protect me. That if I followed the rules, if I did everything right, I would be safe. That I mattered. And when I got transferred, when the report disappeared, when no one stood up for me, I stopped believing in justice the way I used to. Cormac opened his mouth, like he wanted to interrupt, maybe defend himself, but she kept going before he could form a sound. But here's the thing, she said, her voice trembling just slightly now. What you didn't take was my purpose. You didn't take my drive. You didn't take my voice. And you damn sure didn't take my future. You thought you could break me. But all you did, was teach me exactly where the cracks were in this system. He finally spoke, his voice quieter than anyone had ever heard it. I didn't mean for any of this. I was doing my job. I made a mistake. Her head tilted slightly, almost in disbelief. You think this was a mistake? He looked up at her, eyes pleading now, his mask slipping with every second. I thought you were just, someone walking where they weren't supposed to be. I didn't know you had clearance. I didn't know you were, she cut him off. You didn't know I was important. That's what you mean. You didn't see me. You didn't want to. You saw a black woman standing where you didn't think she belonged, and you reacted. That's not a mistake, officer. That's conditioning. That's entitlement. That's power you've never been asked to answer for until now. He rubbed his face with both hands, as if he could wipe away the years she was holding him accountable for. People make bad calls, he muttered. We all do. You're here now. You made it. So what do you want? What do you want from me? Tiana stared at him, long and hard, and for a moment, the room was so still it felt like it had collapsed into itself. I want you to sit with it, she said finally. I want you to feel, for once, what it's like to be on the other side. To be questioned. To be doubted. To have your entire identity reduced to a moment, a uniform, a gesture. I want you to understand that your bad call cost me years. And I want you to know, that I'm not here to destroy you. Cormac looked confused, unsure how to respond, as if that possibility had never occurred to him. I'm here, she said slowly, to rebuild what you helped break. The judge cleared his throat again, his voice softer now, measured. Ms. Hayes, based on the evidence in your testimony, a formal ethics review will proceed immediately. Officer Cormac will be placed on administrative leave pending investigation. Further actions will be determined by the Oversight Board. Cormac didn't move. He seemed frozen in his own disbelief, like he never thought the day would come where he was the one being judged. After the proceedings ended, people rose slowly, unsure whether to approach her, to speak, to say anything. Some nodded. A few even whispered, "Thank you," as they passed. But Tiana didn't need acknowledgement. She wasn't chasing validation. She walked out of the courtroom the same way she had entered it days ago, head high, shoulders back, steady and unshaken. But just before she reached the door, Cormac's voice stopped her. You waited all this time, for this? His tone was hollow now, lost. She turned back one last time. No, she said. I waited for the right time to speak. And for people to finally listen. He didn't follow her. He didn't speak again. He just watched as the woman he had once silenced walked away, this time, not out of the room, but ahead of it. Beyond it. Ahead of him. Outside, the gray sky had given way to a soft rain. Tiana stood on the courthouse steps for a moment, letting the cool droplets land on her skin. She breathed in slowly. It wasn't over. There would be more hearings. More reviews. More walls to tear down. But the hardest part was behind her now. The silence was broken. The truth had been spoken, on record, with power, with clarity. And for the first time in years, she wasn't looking over her shoulder. She was looking forward. What she didn't know yet was that her testimony, her stand, would echo far beyond that courtroom. That her words would be quoted in articles, played on evening news, printed in reports. That the other officers who watched in silence would start asking questions. That complaints once buried would resurface. That change would begin, not because she demanded it, but because she became it. And still, one question lingered. What happens when the system has to answer to the very person it once erased? She was about to find out. The rain had softened by the time Tiana reached the street, turning into a mist that blurred the city's sharp lines and dulled the concrete's edge. She didn't rush. Her steps were deliberate, her mind quiet. Not empty, but still. There was a strange calmness that followed the storm she had unleashed inside those courtroom walls. But she knew better than to mistake quiet for closure. This was not the end. It was a fracture point, the kind of moment that splits timelines into before and after. Something had shifted, not only in her life but in the structure of the institution that had protected the man who once silenced her. What happened inside that room wasn't just about exposing one man's abuse of power, it was about lifting the veil on a culture of permission that allowed harm to be repeated, over and over, under the weight of silence. Back in her office, the tone was different now. Her team moved with a kind of urgency that hadn't existed before. Andre, once cautious and formal, now stepped into her office without hesitation, dropping files and updates as they came in. 3 new complaints came forward this morning, he said, not looking up from the pages. All former clerks. All with stories that match yours in tone, if not in detail. They've been sitting on these for years. Tiana nodded, flipping through the reports, her eyes scanning quickly, the pieces forming themselves without effort. They always had. The problem wasn't putting the puzzle together, it was convincing people to look at the picture it revealed. Now, for the first time, people were looking. Emails flooded in from legal advocates, watchdog groups, and even officers from other departments thanking her for saying what so many couldn't. She read every single one. She didn't reply to all of them. Some didn't require a response. Some just needed to be heard. She understood that now more than ever, how powerful it was just to be acknowledged. To not be dismissed. To have someone say, "I believe you." But with the support came another flood, criticism. Anonymous messages. Calls to the office with vague threats. She's just angry. She's on a witch hunt. She's got an agenda. None of it surprised her. What struck her most was the tone. The fear. People weren't pushing back because they thought she was wrong, they were panicking because they knew she was right. She had triggered something deeper than discomfort. She had disturbed a legacy. A culture that had thrived on unspoken rules and unchecked power. And now, every person who had once felt untouchable was asking themselves, "Am I next?" Meanwhile, Officer Cormack's suspension was made public within days. Not by a press release, but through a leak that spread like wildfire. News outlets picked up the footage from the security camera, the moment of the shove now looping endlessly on screens across the city. The man who once wore his uniform like armor now found himself exposed in every corner of the media. But what stung most wasn't the footage, it was the story behind it. Because as Tiana's name reached headlines, so did the truth he'd long buried. The 2013 complaint. The erasure. The transfer. The power he once had to rewrite the narrative had vanished, and in its place was an account he couldn't edit. He stayed quiet publicly. No interviews. No press conferences. But behind closed doors, he tried to appeal. Letters were sent to the review board, written statements, character witnesses from colleagues he hadn't spoken to in years. None of it worked. The tide had shifted. The people who once overlooked him now distanced themselves out of self-preservation. He called one former partner, no answer. Another officer texted back, "I can't be involved in this. You understand." But he didn't. That was the problem. He didn't understand how quickly power evaporates when the people around you realize it was never rooted in truth, only fear. Back in the Justice Department, Tiana was presented with a choice. The Oversight Board wanted her recommendation. Internal procedure demanded it. Termination is the obvious move, Andre said one evening, leaning against her office wall, arms crossed. He's a liability. The public wants it. You have every right to push for it. She didn't answer right away. She stared out the window, the city's lights flickering in reflections against the glass. She could feel it, the weight of the decision pressing down on her. But it wasn't about the rules. It was about what this moment represented. Because here it was, the dilemma. The moral fork in the road. She had the power now, the very thing that had been used against her. And she had every reason, every justification, to use it the same way it had once been used to bury her. But if she did, was that justice? Or revenge wearing its mask? I don't want to be him, she said finally, voice low. I don't want to confuse accountability with punishment. Andre furrowed his brow. So what does that mean? It means, she said, turning back to him, we give him a choice. He can resign, voluntarily. Publicly. He owns what he did. He apologizes, not to me, but to every person he hurt with his silence, with his force. Or, we move forward with the full review, and he risks having every detail exposed in a hearing he won't control. Andre stared at her, nodding slowly. You sure about that? No, she said honestly. But it's the only path that lets me sleep at night. The next day, her proposal was delivered to Cormac through official channels. No threats. No bait. Just a simple document outlining his options, with a deadline to respond. And for the first time in his life, he had to choose between pride and truth, with no weapon in his hands, no badge to hide behind, and no one to clean up the consequences for him. 3 days passed. No word. And then, quietly, a press release was issued. A statement of resignation. A brief acknowledgement of past errors in judgment. No detailed apology. No names mentioned. But it was something. Not enough for the headlines, maybe. Not enough for every victim. But for Tiana, it marked a turning point, not just for the system, but for herself. Because it wasn't just about what she made him do. It was about what she refused to become. That afternoon, she met with the new recruits at the department. Fresh faces, eager but cautious. She didn't give them a lecture. She told them a story. Not the whole story. Just enough to make them understand that power without awareness becomes violence. That silence in the face of wrongdoing is not neutrality, it's complicity. And that the hardest thing you will ever do in this work is not speaking up. It's choosing who you'll be when no one is watching. One of the new recruits asked her quietly after the session, how did you know it was the right time to come back? Tiana paused, then smiled gently. I didn't, she said. I just knew I couldn't keep waiting for the right time to do the right thing. As she walked back to her office, the hallway felt different. Lighter, somehow. Not because the system had been fixed, but because it had been confronted. Because somewhere in the cracks of what was broken, something honest had taken root. Something that couldn't be silenced anymore. And yet, deep down, she knew the hardest part still lay ahead. Because justice isn't a moment. It's a choice you make over and over again. Even when it costs you everything. The following week unfolded like a slow-burning confession from a city unsure of its own reflection. Tiana walked the familiar hallways with a different rhythm in her step now, not heavier, not lighter, but fuller, like each movement carried more weight, more history, more purpose. The courthouse felt like a space still catching its breath, a building haunted not by ghosts but by truths that had finally been said out loud. Some doors opened for her with newfound respect, others with hesitation, but none with indifference. People knew who she was now, not just by title, not by the quiet authority she had always carried, but by the story she had forced everyone to witness. And while some wanted to pretend that story ended with a resignation letter, Tiana knew better. The real work always begins after the applause fades, after the cameras move on, when there are no headlines left to protect you. She sat alone in her office late into the evening, reviewing new reports, letters, requests for internal reviews, some from officers afraid to speak up under the previous leadership, others from civilians who had never filed a complaint before but felt something shift when they saw her on television. Each one was a thread in a web of silence that had stretched across years, maybe decades. She read them all. Some of the words were raw and angry, others cautious and trembling. They didn't ask for perfection. They asked for acknowledgement. For someone to say, "I see you. I believe you. You matter." And as she moved from letter to letter, she felt their weight stack quietly onto her shoulders, not as a burden, but as a responsibility. This wasn't about punishing one man. This was about redefining what justice could sound like, what accountability could feel like, and who got to deliver it. Andre entered quietly, carrying a folder that looked heavier than most. He placed it on her desk and didn't speak at first. She looked up at him, reading his face before she reached for it. "What is it?" she asked, her voice tired but attentive. He hesitated before answering, like the words themselves had to be handled with care. "It's a request from Officer Cormac. He wants a meeting. Just the two of you." She didn't react immediately. Just stared at the folder like it was a ghost from the past knocking politely on her door. "He said he owes you a conversation," Andre added. "He asked that it not be recorded. No legal counsel. No audience. Just, real." Tiana leaned back slowly, her eyes drifting toward the window, watching the city lights blink like they were signaling something unsaid. The idea of being in a room with him again made her chest tighten, but not with fear. With questions. With the weight of everything that still felt unresolved, even after all that had happened. "Set it up," she said after a long pause. "Tomorrow. Early. Before the building fills up." The next morning, the meeting took place in a small, private conference room on the 6th floor, far from the courtrooms, far from curious eyes. The walls were bare, the light humming overhead like a nervous witness. Cormac arrived before she did, seated at the edge of the table, hands clasped tightly, posture hunched in a way that looked unnatural on someone who used to fill every space like a threat. When Tiana entered, he stood out of habit but quickly realized the gesture felt hollow. She didn't offer a handshake. She didn't sit across from him like a rival. She took her seat with quiet control, placing nothing on the table, no notes, no folders, just herself. For a long moment, neither of them spoke. The silence stretched, not out of tension but because the space needed to breathe. Finally, he broke it, his voice smaller than she remembered. "I didn't ask for this to clear my name," he said. "I know that's not possible. There's been something I've been carrying since that day in court, and it's not just guilt. It's realization." Tiana watched him carefully, saying nothing. He continued. "When I saw your face that day, when you said my name in front of everyone, it was like something cracked open. Not just about what I did to you. But about how many times I've done it to people whose names I never knew. Whose eyes I never met again. I built a version of myself that could walk into a room and decide who mattered, who didn't, who deserved to be treated with dignity and who didn't. And for the longest time, no one stopped me. So I never thought I needed to stop myself." She nodded slowly, her expression unreadable. "That's the difference between guilt and responsibility," she said quietly. "Guilt makes you apologize. Responsibility makes you change." He swallowed hard. "I don't expect you to forgive me. I don't think I even deserve that. But I needed to look you in the eye and say it out loud. I ruined something in you that day, years ago. Something I didn't even bother to see. And when you came back and stood in that courtroom, you reminded me of who I used to be before the badge started to mean more than the person wearing it." Tiana leaned forward slightly, her voice still calm, but firmer now. "You didn't ruin me. You tried. You helped build a system that thrives on fear and silence, and you played your part like it was honorable. But I survived it. I learned from it. And I used it to break the very foundation that protected you." He lowered his gaze, his hands shaking slightly now. "I'm not asking you to believe I'm a different man. But I am asking you to believe that I see it now. The harm. The pattern. The arrogance. And I won't put that uniform on again. Her eyes held his for a long time. "What you do next matters more than anything you say in this room," she said. "Because redemption isn't given. It's earned. Not in words. In action." He nodded, eyes moist now, the bravado gone. He looked older. Smaller. And maybe that was part of the reckoning too, recognizing what happens when power is stripped, and all that's left is who you really are. When he left the room, she stayed behind. Not because she needed time to recover, but because she needed a moment to process the echo of everything that had just happened. She had faced the man who once reduced her to silence, and she hadn't just survived him. She had watched him unravel in front of her, not out of vengeance, but through truth. Later that afternoon, she visited the lower floors of the courthouse, where community liaisons had set up a new resource office for citizens to report misconduct, ask questions, and get legal referrals. It was part of the new reforms she'd proposed, real, tangible changes rooted in prevention, not reaction. A young woman with braids sat behind the desk, eyes wide when Tiana walked in. "I just want to say thank you," she said quietly. "For what you did. For what you're doing. People like me, we don't usually see someone who looks like us making real decisions in places like this." Tiana smiled gently. "Then make sure you're next. Don't wait for permission. Don't wait for the system to catch up. We build it ourselves, brick by brick." As she stepped back out into the hallway, the building felt different again. Not because it had changed. But because she had. And for the first time, the weight she carried didn't feel like a burden, it felt like armor made of every story, every voice, every silence she had turned into sound. She wasn't done yet. The final chapter was still waiting to be written. The sun had begun to dip below the skyline of Birmingham, casting long golden streaks across the gray architecture of the courthouse and painting warm reflections onto the windows of the Justice Department building. Inside, the air held a kind of fragile stillness, the kind that follows a storm not with peace, but with the quiet understanding that nothing will ever be quite the same. Tiana stood at the large glass window of her office, arms folded across her chest, watching as people passed on the sidewalk below, their lives continuing unaware of how many of their stories had been rewritten in rooms like the ones she now walked through with a different nameplate on her door. But she wasn't thinking of titles or cases or power. Not in that moment. She was thinking of voices. Of every person who had come to her since the hearing, each one carrying pain in their throat like a second tongue, waiting for someone to finally ask what they'd been forced to swallow all these years. The knock on her door was soft, hesitant. She turned, expecting Andre, but instead found a woman in her late 50s standing at the threshold. Her gray-streaked locks were pulled into a neat bun, her expression calm but weighted. "You probably don't remember me," she said with a faint smile. "I used to work in records. I was there back in 2013. I remember when you filed that report." Tiana's breath caught slightly. Not from fear, but from the sudden collision of past and present. She gestured for the woman to come in, her voice gentle. "I remember you. You wore blue glasses back then." The woman chuckled softly. "Still do. Different prescription now, though. Time has a way of doing that." They sat in silence for a moment before the woman spoke again. "I want to apologize. I saw what happened back then. I didn't say anything. None of us did. We were scared. You spoke up, and we looked the other way." Her voice cracked at the edges, but her posture didn't waver. "But I've watched what you've done since. And I wanted you to know, it mattered. You mattered. Even when we didn't show it." Tiana felt something shift in her chest, an old scar warming like it was being acknowledged for the first time. "You don't have to apologize," she said softly. "I understand why you didn't speak. I understand what it cost just to sit here and say this now." The woman reached into her bag and pulled out a small envelope. "There's something you should see. I kept it. I wasn't supposed to, but I couldn't throw it away. Inside was a copy of the original complaint Tiana had filed all those years ago. Not the sanitized version. The real one. Her handwriting, her words, unedited and unfiltered. And scribbled on the margins were notes, comments made by higher-ups who had reviewed the report before it disappeared. Tiana's eyes scanned the page, her breath shallow. The notations were brutal. Overreacting. Too emotional. No formal witness. Her hands trembled slightly, not from weakness, but from rage wrapped in validation. She had always known. But now she had proof of the sabotage that cost her a decade. She looked up, eyes shining, voice steady. This is more than evidence. This is the final piece. The woman nodded. Do with it what we should have done back then. Tiana stood and hugged her gently. Not out of obligation. Out of understanding. The kind that doesn't need forgiveness, just presence. Later that night, she met Andre at a small cafe a few blocks from the courthouse. It was rare for them to talk outside the office, but tonight felt different. The kind of night where boundaries between roles and realities blurred into something more human. She slid the envelope across the table, and as he read it, his expression shifted from confusion to fury. They buried this. Deliberately. She nodded. And now we're going to use it. Not to repunish Cormac. That part's done. This is bigger. This is about how the system not only protected him, but erased me. Andre leaned forward, intensity in his voice. What are you thinking? Tiana took a sip of her tea, her voice cool. A public inquiry. Not just into his case, but into the whole structure. I want a full audit of how complaints were handled over the last 15 years. I want transparency. Not hidden behind closed doors. I want the public to see what silence looks like on paper. Andre shook his head with a mix of awe and apprehension. That's going to rattle everyone. Even the people still sitting in their seats. Tiana met his eyes. Good. They should be rattled. The next week was a whirlwind of motion. Meetings with legal advisors, ethics board members, media consultants. There were warnings, of course. Political pressure. Concerns about what this would do to the department's image. But Tiana didn't flinch. Because the truth doesn't ask for permission to exist, it just waits for someone to stop looking away. The announcement of the public inquiry made headlines across the state. Some hailed her as a reformer. Others labeled her a disruptor. She didn't care which one they chose. She wasn't here to make people comfortable. She was here to make things clear. The day of the first public forum, a line wrapped around the courthouse. Not just lawyers and reporters, but everyday people. Mothers, students, retired officers, men in suits, women with clipboards, kids too young to understand the weight of the building they were walking into but old enough to feel the tension in the air. Tiana sat at the front of the room, flanked by a panel of independent auditors and investigators. She didn't speak at first. She listened. To the man who talked about being wrongly detained outside a courtroom and missing the custody hearing for his daughter. To the woman who said her brother filed a complaint after being shoved by a bailiff, and was arrested 2 weeks later for disorderly conduct. To the former court translator who spoke about being verbally harassed for her accent. Story after story. Not all connected directly to Cormac. But all connected to the same disease, indifference dressed in procedure. When it was finally her turn to speak, Tiana stood slowly. These stories are not anomalies. They are symptoms. Of a culture that has for too long confused order with justice. That has weaponized silence. That has turned the courtroom from a place of truth into a theater of control. And we're not here to make excuses. We're here to tell the truth, so it never happens again. The room erupted into applause, not of celebration, but of release. Of people who had waited years, maybe lifetimes, to be seen not as problems, but as proof. Back in her office that evening, the weight of the day began to settle in. Not as exhaustion, but as clarity. The inquiry would continue for weeks. There would be more hearings. More stories. More resistance. But now, the foundation was shaking. And in the cracks, something honest was beginning to grow. Tiana sat at her desk, the window open just enough to let in the cool breeze. On her wall hung a photo, not of the hearing, not of the press, but of her mother, standing outside their childhood home, holding Tiana's first report card in her hands with a smile that said, "You are already everything they said you'd never be." She smiled back at the memory. She wasn't done yet. But she was exactly where she needed to be. Weeks turned into months, and the inquiry evolved from a departmental review into a statewide conversation. Tiana became more than a leader, she became a symbol. Not because she sought it, but because she embodied what people had been hoping to see for so long, someone who didn't just rise through the system but transformed it from within. The audit uncovered more than expected. A network of buried complaints, ignored grievances, altered files, and institutional patterns that no longer could be hidden under bureaucracy and protocol. Policies began to change, not just in Jefferson County but across other departments inspired by what had unfolded. A precedent had been set. And Tiana's name now carried a weight that reached beyond her own city. She stood, months later, at a podium inside a packed auditorium as she accepted the National Justice Reform Award, a ceremony attended by leaders from across the country. She wasn't the kind of person who chased praise, but she understood what this moment meant. It wasn't just for her. It was for every voice that had been buried under silence. For every survivor of abuse cloaked in a uniform. She took the stage with humility, her voice steady, but this time, she let herself speak from a place of healing rather than defense. She talked about the cost of silence, about the pain of being overlooked, and the unexpected strength that comes from standing alone until others find the courage to stand with you. Her speech ended not with applause, but with a standing ovation, an eruption of energy not for victory, but for truth. And as she stepped off that stage, the applause still ringing in her ears, she knew something had closed inside her, not a wound, but a chapter. Officer Cormack, meanwhile, faded from public view. He moved out of Birmingham quietly, unable to walk the same streets without feeling the weight of eyes, whispers, or the occasional glare from people who once crossed paths with him without consequence. For a time, he tried to live as if the world hadn't changed, but it had. And so had he. He found work at a private security firm, far from the authority he once wielded. Occasionally, he'd see an article or news segment about the inquiry, and each time, he'd feel the same dull ache in his chest, not from humiliation, but from recognition. He had become the very thing he once claimed to fight. But the most surprising shift happened in his own reflection. For the first time in his life, he saw his actions for what they were. Not mistakes. Choices. And while he would never return to his old role, he began to speak, anonymously at first, sharing with small groups of trainees what unchecked power can become. He told them about the moment he lost his humanity without realizing it, and what it cost him. It wasn't redemption. But it was something. Andre remained by Tiana's side, promoted now to deputy director. The partnership they formed had turned into a quiet force, one driven not by ambition but by conviction. Together, they implemented new training programs, created anonymous reporting pathways, and built alliances with advocacy groups who had once been shut out of policy decisions. Andre often said it felt like they were planting trees they might never sit under. But Tiana reminded him that the shade would still matter to someone. And that was enough. And then there were the people, the nameless, faceless ones who had once stood in courthouse hallways feeling invisible. They started showing up again. Filing reports. Asking questions. Requesting records. Not with fear, but with expectation. The culture had shifted. Not completely. Not perfectly. But undeniably. Tiana's life outside the courtroom slowly found balance again. She returned to the west side, to her old neighborhood, where a community mural had been painted on a brick wall, her silhouette standing tall among images of children, elders, and open hands. She walked by it one afternoon and paused, watching a group of young girls point up at the image with curiosity. One of them turned and asked, "Is that you?" She smiled, crouched to their level, and said, "It could be you too." Later that evening, she sat on her apartment balcony, a breeze tugging gently at her hair, a cup of tea warming her palms. She thought of the woman she was that day walking into the courtroom, not knowing what storm would unfold. She thought of the years she had nearly let her silence define her. And now, as the city settled under the dusk light, she felt something rare, peace. Not because everything had been fixed, but because she had faced it. Head on. With dignity. With truth. And to you, the one listening now, maybe you felt invisible too. Maybe you've been told that speaking up won't matter, that standing alone will only break you. But hear this, the most dangerous lie is that silence keeps you safe. Tiana's story isn't just about justice. It's about the quiet strength of choosing not to disappear. It's about what happens when the person they try to erase comes back holding the pen. So now we ask you, what would you have done in her place? Would you have chosen revenge, or something greater? What does justice mean to you when it's finally in your hands? Comment below and tell us what part of this story moved you most. Your voice matters here. And if this story shook something in you, if it made you think, reflect, or feel seen, don't forget to subscribe to Tales of Twist for more stories that uncover truth, reveal resilience, and leave you with one final question that stays with you long after the screen goes dark.